Hi folks, and welcome back to another tabletop encounter from the campaign blog. This time we have the Russians with the French defending the town and the river crossing. Have a look on the campaign map, give you a rough idea where we are. This time the encounters come about where the Russians have invested this town here and are moving across to tie down this sector of the battlefield, or the campaign map I should say, and Marshal Victor's recovering corps, shall I say, is the only thing stopping them at the moment, and General Saxton's Russian corps has not done anything in the entire campaign so far. This is going to be the first encounter for the Russians against the French. I'll have a closer look at the forces. I'll start with the French, and we have a slightly depleted in number French division with some provisional dragoons attached. We have another French depleted division here with some provisional infantry attached, and we have almost up to full strength infantry division with some more divisional dragoons attached. Numbers wise, the French match the Russians with artillery and infantry, but they are somewhat outnumbered with cavalry, as you'll see when I swim across. The Russians have one cavalry division made up of Cossacks and Hussars. The centre is made up of one division of infantry, another division of infantry. If we swing right over the other side into the sunshine, we have another cavalry division made up of Hussars and dragoons. So as I say, the French are somewhat outnumbered with regards to cavalry. Again, I'm going to be using my own wargaming rules, and further to that, you probably noticed number discs next to each of the divisional commanders, and I thought I'd just quickly run through the first phase of my rules, which is the command phase. And how I do it is each of the corps commanders and divisional commanders, of which there are 5 in the Russian army, I roll a dice for each one. I then look at whether I've rolled any numbers corresponding to the divisional commanders, and if we quickly run along the dice, I've managed to roll quite well actually, apart from the 2 middle dice, because I don't have any divisional commanders. Divisional commanders have a activation rating between 2 and 5, which I don't actually have a 2 or a 5 activated divisional commander in the Russian army. But let's say, for instance, I've rolled a 1, because a corps commander can take a 1 dice or a 6 dice, and the corps commander can use this dice in 2 ways. Either he can use that dice to move himself, or he can use the dice to influence the overall command, and he can do that by adding 1 or taking away 1 on the d6 rolls. And I'm going to add 1 because over here I have a divisional commander with the AR of 3. So now all of the Russian divisional commanders can now be activated. You do the same to the French. I won't bother rolling the dice. And then movement and shooting is done in sequence, and the way I do this is that number 2 activation divisional commanders can move, basically the French or the Russian. Then I move on to number 3s, number 4s and number 5s. If you remember, the Corps Commander can activate on a D6 on a 1 or a 6, which gives him the option to move right at the beginning of a turn or right at the end of a turn. And that's basically how I do the command phase. So movement and shooting is done under sequence. Once all the divisions have moved their brigades, they can then go on to the shooting following the same sequence. First of all, the activations number 2, 3, 4 and then 5. Combat itself is done simultaneously by both sides once in contact. That's the basic rundown of how my rules work, and no further ado, I'm now going to get into the action. I'll get the discs out of the way because I like to keep a clean table just to make it look nice for myself and people to watch. So I'll come back to you at the end of turn 1. And we're back at the end of turn 1, and this Russian cavalry division are slowly but surely making their way up through the woods with a plan to crossing somewhere here and enveloping this flank. The other infantry, Russian infantry division, has started up as well. They got their activation point and they're making their way across. So they're going to throw the Jaegers and possibly the artillery over this river if they can get it across, and harass this flank as much as they can. The other two divisions, cavalry and infantry division, didn't get any activation at all, so they're sitting there doing absolutely nothing. The French themselves were quite content, just playing the waiting game for now to see where the Russians are going to try and put their main weight to try and push them off the board. We have 12 game turns deemed for a whole day, so if the French are still there, then it's a victory to themselves. If the Russians have managed to force the French to retreat or defeated them, then it's a Russian victory. So we'll come back at the end of turn 2 and see what the action is. And we're back at the end of turn 2, and more movement from this cavalry division. The Russian Cossacks are making their way around quickly. They're going to try and forward over here, as I said. The Russian Hussars are just moving slowly but surely on the flank. I think they're going to let the Cossacks do the fighting. That's if we can convince them to do some fighting. And the this infantry division are moving forward, Jaegers to the front. As I say, their plan is to get onto this area of land in between the river and harass the French in this quarter. And again, these guys are doing diddly squit. They're just sitting there quite happily watching, although the other cavalry division did sort of activate, but it's early moves yet, so they're just picking their way. They've got the Hussars, Russian Hussars anyway, are picking their way across the small stream, and their plan is to basically do the same thing. They're going to somehow get across the river here if they can, and harass this flank to try and hem the French in and give them no options, basically. We'll come back at the end of turn 2, or just before the French game. More than happy just to watch at the moment. They've engaged the artillery piece here, has just been firing shots, bouncing them over here towards the advancing Russians, but have actually done nothing. And this artillery piece fired across here as well, but again, little effect other than making a lot of noise. So I'll get back to you at the end of turn 3. And here we are at the end of turn 3, and this cavalry division just keeps moving forward. I think it's going to be a race between these two units, which one can find the river crossing perhaps, I don't know. They seem to be quite eager to get there. This unit stalled, as in didn't get the activation for it, and this unit here hasn't moved at all, although to be honest it's not that much of a problem. It would be nice if they could move on shortly. And the Russian Hussars right over here have managed to find a way across the small stream. Maybe they might be lucky to find a way across the other stream as well, but you never know. So that's the situation at the moment. Once again, the French, other than the provisional dragoons moving out slightly to hedge their bets against whoever comes over first. We'll see what happens over there. They're horribly outnumbered, those guys. Pretty brave just to stay there, really, to be very honest. But anyway, we'll see what happens, and I'll come back to you at the end of turn 4. And we're back again at the end of turn 4, and Russian Hussars have picked themselves across the small stream, but haven't as yet found the crossing. The dragoons themselves are just standing still. They're pretty much the reserve anyway, or the hammer, depends on whether they're going to get engaged into the battle. This dragoon has now, this division has now moved forwards. This division also has moved forwards as well. They're onto the end of the streamline, and now they're going to attempt to cross. And right over the far side, both cavalry units have made it onto the riverbank at least, and we're also trying to find a way over, or they're just going to go straight weight and over on the horses anyway, so we'll see what happens. Once again, the French pretty much happy to engage in long-range artillery fire. This artillery battery has been firing, and this artillery battery has been firing into this area. This artillery battery has been firing long shots right across over to the valley, over to the Russians here, and this artillery battery has switched its target to fire on the advancing Hussars, just to slow them down, perhaps. You never know. The situation at the end of turn 4, I'll come back at the end of turn 5. And here we are at the end of turn 6. Sorry, turn 5 I should say. And if you look right over the other side, the Cossacks made a river crossing, but the Hussars, the French dragoons just literally pounced on them as soon as they got on the other side of the river. So yeah, can't see the Cossacks lasting very long about, even if they are fighting provisional dragoons, they're definitely at the disadvantage there. The Russian Jaegers have made it onto the island and are now starting to pepper shots over the other side of the river to harass the artillery and the infantry on the other side of the bank. The central Russian division has made its way steadily but surely up towards the river crossing. The Hussars on the far side haven't found a river crossing as yet, and right in the far corner in the woods, the provisional dragoons have moved over. Again, I imagine the same plan. As soon as Russian cavalry make itself onto the dry land, they're just going to literally pounce on them, giving them no time whatsoever to form up. So again, they'll be to a disadvantage. That's pretty much it at the end of the 5th turn. Head to the 6th turn, which is going to be halfway, and the Russians are making, I guess, steady progress, but they're going to have to get themselves into gear, because as I say, this is the next, with the end of turn 6. I'll see you then. And we're back at the end of turn 6, and this time the Russian Cossacks have come over in en masse. The dragoons have, the French dragoons I should say, have sent one unit of Russian Cossacks panicking back over the river. But as I say, this time they've come over in strength, so we'll see how the contest goes with that one. The Russians have decided they're just going to come en masse over this river and attack the French town. They've given up trying to get their cannon over the river and have positioned the battery to harass the help harass the centre of the river crossing. They've also been joined by another Russian battery as well, so they're going to be firing shots into this area here to try and demoralise and break the French, I should say, before they Russian infantry can make contact. The Russian infantry are moving up fast. The French, again, not really doing much other than they've engaged with sporadic musket fire and cannon fire on these guys here, but pretty much they've done damage, but not enough to slow them down. And as I say, this artillery battery is still firing away at the Russian hussars, who still haven't found a river crossing yet. So don't know, they could be doing that all day, you never know. And that's the end of turn 6, and that is halfway through the game. So other than over here, the Russians really, although they're doing okay, they're getting there, but they haven't really pressed the French much at all yet. Casualties are light on both sides. As I say, it's only been in the artillery and musketry duels at the moment, so the button bayonet stuff hasn't even started yet. So I'll get back to you at the end of turn 7. End of turn 7, and the Cossacks have forced the provisional dragoons, sheer weight of number I would say, to start to withdraw, and the Russian hussars are giving up trying to find their way across the river. They're now swung round and going across the river where the Cossacks did. Russian infantry division are basically lined up ready to wade across the next part of the river and start attacking the French holding this position. And the other Russian division are about to get their feet wet as well as they make their way across the river. And still, as of yet, the Hussars have found no way across the river. I think they're going to give up next turn and swing round and neatly file up behind the columns of Russian infantry waiting to assault the river and go in after them. And that's the end of turn 7, and I'll get back to you with the situation at the end of turn 8. And here we are at the end of turn 8, and the French provisional dragoons have had enough. They're being chased off by the Cossacks. I think they did pretty well considering the numbers they were facing. The Russian hussars are making their way over the bridge as well, so the French are going to have to watch this flank. They're going to have to move something over to here to pepper them with something to stop them just walking right the way around them and cutting off their line of retreat. The Russian infantry division is halfway across the river now. They're starting to take some casualties quite heavily now because they've got 2. The artillery unit that was here has withdrawn out of the way to try and bring up as much musketry as possible because they know what's coming out of that river. And they've got 1 artillery piece firing away still at them, but they haven't, as I say, they've got as much firepower along that bank as possible to you never know, even stop the Russian advance. The artillery pieces here have been pounding away, and they are actually starting to take effect now on the French. Although the French have brought up, they again have withdrawn this artillery piece, and they've brought some muskets up now to try and cause as much damage as possible as these Jaegers come flying across the river. They've also swung this unit as well round to increase the firepower to try and slow them down. They've also moved this artillery piece up, and they've now, totally ignoring the Russian hussars that are just picnicking, I think, over on the other side of the riverbank there. They're firing across into here as well with the artillery piece. So yeah, they're doing quite a bit of damage on the Russians, but just not enough. They haven't hit their withdrawal point yet. So that brigade, I should say. So they're still fighting on pretty well, I must admit. The dragoons, although I could have moved them I'm just sort of leaving them there because, as I say, there's a bit of a bottleneck anyway, but if there's any space or worse comes to the worst and the French go on the offensive, they'll come into play and just charge across and stop any Frenchman who dares come across that river. But as I say, that's the end of turn 8. Things are starting hot up now. It's going to be some button bayonet stuff soon, I reckon. So we'll see how well the French hold on. And as I say, both sides are fighting pretty well at the moment. So we'll see what happens. Back at the end of turn 9. And here we are at the end of turn 9. And the the French dragoons are off the field, but unfortunately for the Russians, so are the Cossacks. They've decided to chase them all the way home to Paris by the looks of things. So, yeah, they're off the field. The Russian Hussars have moved over, and just had a camera shot actually, but just behind this building here, the French have moved up their artillery and some infantry just to make sure that the Russian Hussars don't sneak in on the flank. Over in this section here, there's some serious battle going on here. I tell you, there's some pretty high dice scores and some pretty hard fighting going on, and both sides are taking some pretty heavy casualties. So we'll see who comes out on top on that one. There's a lot more Russians than there are French, but the French are holding in there for the moment. And also in this section here as well, the Russians have made it across, smashed into the French. The French have held the initial impact, but they did take some casualties as well. So again, the French might be in a little bit of trouble there. I don't know. The Hussars, don't know, but I think they're taking the day off. I think I don't know what's happened to them. But I've the division activated, but I've basically used that to move the Russian dragoons over to see if I can get them across the river as well at a later date, just in case the French hold out. Just sheer weight of numbers should tell. As I say, if things go badly, I'll get the Hussars to move. But at the moment, I think it's just quite funny that they're just milling around on the other side of the stream there. That's at the end of turn 9. I get back to the turn 10. And here we are at the end of turn 10, and Russian Hussars really haven't done much. They've taken the odd shot from the French artillery and musketry fire, but as I say, they haven't done much. But in the centre of the village, the Russians are in. They've pushed the French right the way back into the actual town itself, and they're over the walls and barricades, and yeah, some serious hard fighting from the Russians there. They've pushed the French right back. All the French can do is to next turn is to throw their 3 battalions of provisional infantry into the fray as well. Although, yeah, I wouldn't want to be them. Some real hard fighting going on. But this side over here, the French are holding. The Russians are desperately trying to get more troops over. There's some artillery fire from the Russians. There's some artillery fire from the French. They've also moved their artillery back right over here because they're going to bring them over to here and start popping over the tops of their own men, trying to cause as much devastation to the Russians as possible. They've brought up the French reserve that was residing in the chateau area here. They've brought those out as well. So I think pretty much there's going to be a stalemate in that area there. The Russians are fighting hard, but the French are just not falling back. But if this flank does collapse, then the Russians are just going to come in on their flanks, and it's going to be pretty much all over for the French. But as I say, we'll carry on fighting, and so that's the end of turn 10. I'll go back to the turn 11. And here we are at the end of turn 11, and things are looking pretty bad in this quarter of the battle. The French are being pushed back, and they've pretty much hit their all the brigades have now hit their withdrawal section on their chart, so they're now falling back. The Russian Hussars, sensing victory, have swung in round on the flanks now, so they're throwing themselves into the battle as well to pick off anybody that tries to leg it out the back of the village. And the Russians have also broken through, albeit not quite so well as the other flank, but they have finally broken through as well. So it's looking like a Russian victory, but it has come at some cost. They've taken casualties quite heavy on their infantry, although the cavalry hasn't really done much apart from chase off some provisional dragoons and run after them. So their cavalry is pretty much unscathed because they haven't really done anything. Most of the fighting, in fact pretty much all the fighting, has been done by their infantry. So got one more turn to go, and I'll come back then with a summary of the last turn and the game itself. And here we are at the end of turn 12, I should say, and the French are disengaging. Basically, they've had enough. They're not going to. They're going to find themselves surrounded and cut off from many lines of retreat. So they're withdrawing now while the going's good. The Russian infantry are not pursuing. They're absolutely exhausted, so they're going to leave it to the Russian cavalry to chase the French away. So that's it. The Russians' first engagement is a victory, and yeah, it's that was a hard fought battle. Once the started off with a lot of movement from the Russians and sporadic musket and artillery fire, but once it came down to it, the Russians with the button bayonet are fearsome fighters, and they made short work of this section here, which I thought was going to hold, but no, they went straight through those, and they eventually broke through here as well by sheer weight of number, and it was a case of which side reached their withdrawal point first, really. As I say, the Russian infantry took a battering. We'll see what happens on the casualty dice rolls, but the Russian cavalry pretty much unscathed. The Russian Hussars over this flank just didn't want to play at all today. They're still trying to find a forward over. I think it's an excuse myself personally. But anyway, there you go. That's the battle between the French and the Russians. As always, thanks for taking time to watch the video, and I hope you enjoyed it as much watching it as I did playing it. And questions, queries, leave them in the comments afterwards and I'll get back to you. And as always, bye for now.